Here at Charlie Crimebuster, we welcome comments, suggestions, opinions, and whether you agree or disagree with our view on a topic, we still want to hear from you. Reach out with a shout-out. Email Charlie at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. And we'd like to thank our sponsor, PeacemakerNetwork.com, and also thank those of you who already support our podcast. Did you know that your donations not only help with this podcast, but also support the brave men and women, first responders, law enforcement, correction officers, security personnel, and our military? You too can donate, as well as become a monthly badge member. That's BADGE member by simply subscribing to PeacemakerNetwork.com. That's PeacemakerNetwork.com. And if you're a true crime junkie, we would like to encourage you to binge-cast by listening to our podcasts located on many of the popular podcast platforms. Simply search for Charlie Crimebuster, or you can ask your smart speaker to play Charlie Crimebuster. But since you're streaming us here on YouTube tonight, simply click on the subscribe button and you'll be notified each time we drop a new episode. So please do us that huge favor and press that subscribe button right now. And we thank you. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law.
The Karen Reed retrial. Did the prosecution tank the trial by the witnesses they called this week? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more about the retrial on today's Charlie Crime Talk. Joining me is James Buckland, our producer. He's going to be asking some questions, and we're going to be talking the talk about the Karen Reed retrial, murder retrial. It is called by some people the retrial of the century. This weekend is a perfect time to binge cast because the court, is going to have a short week, and we've got the Memorial Day weekend. So, to me, a good opportunity for people, if they haven't been following the trial, they want to get caught up on the trial, is over the weekend. They can, Friday, Saturday, they can get right there on the YouTube channel or on charliecrimebuster.com. And they can just take all the weeks that we've been covering, because we've been covering it from day one in the trial, right?
That's right.
And they can just binge it and get right on up on it. And guess what? By this weekend, and maybe we might even drop it a day early or something other, because I'm going to try to do a little early work this weekend. They could then get our coming podcasts that would then get them caught up with this week that we're talking about. I'm talking about in real time right now that we're talking about. So they would come into next week right caught up on the trial.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's over 300 episodes there on YouTube that they can listen to, binge cast all weekend.
Did you say 300?
Over 300. Over 300.
I told somebody the other day, I said, I think we've done over 200.
That's well over 200.
And now you're telling me 300. Wow. Time goes fast when you're having fun, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
right. And on top of that, on top of those 300, there are, for those of you who are really glued to this particular trial, and it seems like a lot of people are, there's tons of podcasts just related to this trial. Even the first trial, I guess we covered that as well, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah.
We certainly did.
That's right. We even did I think we did a little poll on that. And
we did.
The poll pretty well kind of told us what was happening with it. And so let me encourage you folks, if you haven't gotten caught up on this trial, it's a good opportunity to do it this weekend. I am fascinated by this trial. So many other people are. I don't know that I've ever really viewed a trial with so much fascinating material as this, and at the same time find so many people divided over what happened. So I think this is an excellent trial for our crime junkies out there, right?
I agree, Charlie. It's interesting with this trial that there's because people that caught the first part of it and have been keeping up with us have already basically, like you mentioned, drawn lines and a bias to what side they want to follow. So anything that's brought up in the court now in the second trial, they seem to lean towards what they had determined from the first trial. And what we're uncovering now is that there's more information that was not in the first trial that is now coming out in the second trial.
Exactly, exactly. So, I thought, and probably other people thought, well, this is going to be a rerun of the first trial, but it is a rerun, but there's a whole lot of incredible stuff coming out, and we just can't wait to share it with the folks that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's people that are have been caught lying. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure you're going to disclose more on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's that when we get this weekend's podcast, we got a lot of things to say
Yeah.
in the new coming podcast this weekend about what's happened this week. But today we're talking about what happened last week and week four of the coverage, and let's get people caught up from week four then.
Well, in week four,
Mhm.
especially the coverage for this particular second retrial of Karen Reed, you mentioned that there were two unexpected things that occurred. Tell us about at least one of them.
Well, I did mention that there were two unexpected things because people think you're going to hear the same thing over and over again, but there were two unexpected things that came into play in week four. And one of them I thought was very unusual. And I kind of introduced it. I had to go out of Florida to do this, James, because it wouldn't work in Florida. But, when I was in the hills of Tennessee, working in law enforcement, and even as a child in the hills of Tennessee, we had some times when the snow would come down, and we would be so excited as kids on that night before the snow hit
Uh-huh.
because if you had a snow day, that meant that sometimes you wouldn't have to go to school, right?
That's right. That's
It would
right.
snow. It would snow so much it was dangerous to get on the road, and you didn't have to go to school. So I have been guilty, and I believe there are a lot of other people outside of the state of Florida. You and I are in Florida today. It didn't happen in Florida probably, but I believe a lot of people were guilty of maybe even the night before praying that snow might land
Hmm.
so you don't have to go to school the next day. Well, it wasn't snow that canceled court for a day, but court was actually canceled for a day during week four on Tuesday of last week. Suddenly, there was an announcement that due to unforeseen circumstances, court will not be held today. And
Hmm.
there are, of course, people who speculated what happened. And the best that I can find from watching, reviewing, and analyzing and hearing things is that most people think that it was because that the defendant wasn't feeling well and perhaps was ill. Now, I can't verify that for the fact because of the fact that there's HIPAA laws, and so the court's not going to come out and say that.
Exactly.
But that seems to be what the rumor are. But regardless of what happened, the unexpected thing was everybody got ready to go to court on Tuesday morning, and suddenly they had an announcement. Nope, no court today. And that does happen. I in trials, it's happened before, and there have been times in trials where it has been because of weather. Like
Oh
we're
yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about. As
Yeah.
far as I go. And if you want to turn it around and help our Florida folks that are listening to us, the same thing happens when hurricanes hit, right?
That's
You know,
right. That's right.
hurricanes and bad weather and floods and that sort of thing, tropical storms and hurricanes, and goodness gracious, I hate to think about it, but we're just about getting back into hurricane season down here in Florida,
That's right.
right?
That's
Yeah.
right. That's
So
right.
court was canceled for one day, and that was unexpected.
Well, Charlie, you mentioned a phrase, and we want to remind our audience if they didn't listen to the first one where you very clearly explained it. But for those that don't know, what is the Proctor factor?
The Proctor factor, that's kind of catchy, isn't it?
It is. I
Yeah.
like that.
And I really didn't hear it from anybody, but probably somebody else has said it. I don't know. But the Proctor factor, I kind of would like to adopt that one for myself. But the Proctor factor simply meant in the opening, you may have heard the opening, and Alan Jackson said that he talked about Trooper Proctor and that everything that Trooper Proctor touched was just like a cancer on the case. And it truly
Mm.
was because this guy was not only inappropriate, he was spectacularly inappropriate
As an investigator,
and
yes.
spectacularly inappropriate. Takes it, I think, to a new level. He would text his friends. One example of it, and I think was very very crude and rude, is the friend asked when he was going through Karen Reed's phone, "Did you find any nudes in there?" And then
Hmm.
he talked about how what a terrible person she was, and how he hoped that she would just kill herself.
Hmm.
That's terrible, terrible things.
That
As an
is
investigator, you're supposed to be non-partial. You're supposed to look as the old Dragnet show was with Jack Webb.
right.
Just the facts, ma'am, just the
That,
facts. You're supposed
exactly.
to look at the facts. You're not supposed to get involved in that. But he not only thought that, he would communicate that, and he really got in trouble for communicating that. And so then, he was on the first trial. He was just really, 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 I mean, brought down on the stand by Alan Jackson. And it's understandable that it looks like that they're not even going to call him this trial. They're going to try to get around that. But everything he touches is cancer, and you can rest assured throughout this entire trial, every time the defense has an opportunity to bring Michael Proctor back into the trial, they do. And by now, I'm sure the jury knows that Proctor is cancerous, and the Proctor factor is very much a part of this case.
Well, since Proctor was the one that's been destroying the first case, in what way could the prosecution's witnesses this time round be tanking the prosecution's case?
Well, yeah, that was the title of our podcast last week that we just dropped, and
Hmm.
and we said that they're taking it, and it just really come to my attention. It just seemed like every time you turn around, this is the prosecution now that is putting on their case,
Hmm.
and yet it seems like that every one of these witnesses, the defense turns around and gets great points for the defense.
Yeah.
A good example is, Sergeant Mechanic, who we talked about. He was the guy they brought in place of Proctor. Basically, they were saying, he was Proctor's supervisor. So
Hmm.
because he was Proctor's supervisor, he had more authority over the case than anything else. But yet, while they had him on the stand, they were able to turn around and say, by the way, and they showed the video of her that early morning, because there's a lot of controversy about how that tail light was broken.
Right.
The prosecution says broke because she hit O'Keefe with the car. The defense is saying that what really happened to break that tail light was that she backed out of the car, out of the garage early that morning when they were going to look for John O'Keefe,
Hmm.
and she actually hit John O'Keefe's car. And when he had the good sergeant on the witness stand, they were able to point out that the wheel moved when the car came up against the other one to show that there was impact. And Sergeant Mechanic had to admit on the stand,
Hmm.
yes, it looks like there was impact. Now,
Right.
that doesn't necessarily mean the taillight was broken or not broken, but it does mean there was impact. There was the opportunity there.
Right.
And so here is an example of where they had one witness for the prosecution turned around to make a big hit for the defense. The same thing was true of Jennifer McCabe. They finished up her testimony this last week at the very beginning of it. And the same thing happened with her. They were talking to her about the investigations, the Fed investigation, and the fact that she failed to say to the investigators that before she talked to them, she talked to her brother-in-law.
Hmm.
So the defense is doing an exceptional job of taking strong witnesses for the prosecution and turning around and scoring points for the defense.
Hmm.
So I think it is very obvious that if you look back at it, you just shake your head and say, is the prosecution doing this on purpose?
Right.
I don't believe for one moment they are, and I mentioned at the end of the podcast that there's still a lot of time for the prosecution to get a lot stronger, and I think we're going to see that this next week, and we're going to show that it did get stronger in a lot of areas. But nonetheless, when you look at all these prosecution witnesses and see how many points the defense is making with probable doubt or reasonable doubt, I think that you could be saying, "Hey, are they tanking the case?"
Right. Well, so staying on the topic of Sergeant Buchanan, what was it that you called the worst mistake that he did, in your opinion?
Well, there's so many of them. I don't know that you could say. I think that the biggest thing that comes to my mind with mechanic is that I think my personal opinion, and I'm trying to look at it from the standpoint of a juror, is that he picked the wrong hills to die on.
Hmm.
There were some things, that was very obvious to the jury. It was
Oh, yeah.
obvious to me. It was obvious to anybody listening. But
Right.
instead of him just saying, "Yeah, yeah, that what happened," he would become very defensive. For example, instead of just saying, "We all know there were terrible mistakes made in this investigation," so instead of him just saying, "Yeah, there were terrible mistakes made in the investigation," but that really didn't change the evidence that Karen hit O'Keefe. Instead of saying that, he would try to argue and try to defend these mistakes. And
Hmm.
I think in that area he lost credibility, and I think that was a mistake. But by far, when you ask me what was the worst mistake he made, I think it happened during the fourth week when Alan Jackson was talking to him and cross-examining him, and they brought out all these terrible things about Michael Proctor.
Hmm.
How
Hmm.
he failed here and he failed there, and he was biased and all this sort of thing just really really showed that this guy was, as I said, spectacularly inappropriate.
Hmm.
He then asked him. He said, "Now you have said that Michael Proctor is a man of integrity, that he's a man of honor, that you gave him high marks when you evaluated him. Do you still say that he's a man of integrity and honor?" And Sergeant Mechanic said, "Yes, he's a man of honor and outstanding integrity." Now, how could you
Hmm.
say that when it's very apparent to the jury that this guy isn't? So, in my opinion, it says to me that if that is the way that Sergeant Mechanic, if that's the way that he defines integrity, wonder if he has integrity himself.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
know,
you,
I
oh,
mean, I
you,
mean that basically puts you down. I mean, he would have been better to say, "Hey, uh, at times Proctor has been a very good investigator, but this time he blew it. This time he
hmm.
wasn't a man of integrity. He
Right.
wasn't." If he had said that, I think at the same time he would have at least, he would be able to stand up for his friend some, saying, "Hey, he has been an outstanding investigator, but he blew it this time." If he
As
had just admitted that, I think it would have gone a long way with the jury.
well, as a juror, you're looking at the fact that the prosecutor, the sergeant, and the judge, all on the same team.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
they're
it,
out to
it
protect each
actually
other. Yeah.
it actually yeah, it turns around that way. And the other thing involved in that as far as him, that if you think then that he doesn't, uh, nobody believes. I don't know anybody that would think that Proctor had integrity in the way he handled the case. So
Not with
if
all the mistakes has been
if
disclosed. No.
if you think that, if you're in that camp, then if you're trying to hide the fact that he made those mistakes, what else are you hiding?
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Where else are you cutting the corners?
Exactly.
Where else are you trying to deceive us as a juror? Where else are you? What else are you hiding? That was, I think, the greatest mistake that Buchanan made. I think Buchanan's an outstanding trooper. I think he's done a good job in his career, but the way he handled this on the stand, I think was a terrible, terrible mistake. And I think it will not only hurt the case, I think it'll hurt him in the
Hmm.
future as a trooper.
I
Why
agree.
don't you just submit? I mean, I'm me, my blood my blood is blue. I'm back. We here at Charlie Crimebuster.
Yeah,
We're aligned with PeacemakerNetwork.com. We're
that's
aligned
right.
with these brave men and women of military and law enforcement. We love them and we support them. But I'm not going to support a bad cop. I'm not going to support a crooked cop. I'm not going to support a guy who has lost integrity. I'm not going to support a guy who will tank, an investigation.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, you were talking about being brave. You have to be brave to tell the truth and exactly how you see the facts to be, you know?
Excellent point. Excellent point. It would take courage for him to sit up and say, "Hey,
Exactly.
he blew it, man.
He did. He
He's a
did.
friend. I like him. He's done an outstanding job in the past, but he flat blew it in this case,
Well, so you have to
and he
keep in
would have had
mind,
integrity."
you have to keep in mind that if they make all of the cases, especially the case that Proctor, anything that Proctor touches or has touched in the past will have a ripple effect. So
Yes.
therefore, anything could be thrown out of court because Proctor was the investigator. So you have to
Yeah.
kind of keep that in mind too, and the fact that also Buchanan, he has to protect everything that he signed off on that Proctor did. So again,
Exactly.
it's that
Yeah,
ripple effect.
and then you go on top of that it was already admitted even on his direct examination that he himself was disciplined
Hmm.
by the way he handled that situation.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
I guess I'm saying that the man that they brought in to try to offset Proctor, I don't think it worked a whole lot.
No,
I think it worked against them.
I agree with
If
you.
anything else, yeah.
I agree with you. Let's wrap up the first segment and go into our crazy crook story of this week.
Well, a crazy quick story this week. We've got them all over the place. These are two guys from Georgia who decided to rob some people of some gaming material, and those things can be expensive.
Hmm.
They had it all lined up. They made their getaway. The only problem was, first of all, you know, I don't know about you, James, but if I'm going down the road and I see a Tulsa, one of those trucks come by, it stands out to me. Does it stand out to you? Those
Oh
Tulsa,
yeah. Oh yeah.
big time. So
Yeah.
why would you pick that vehicle first as your getaway vehicle, right? It's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean,
Very.
if I'm driving down the interstate and I see one of those, that thing stands out like a sore thumb.
Yep.
The way it's shaped, the color of it. You can't
Yeah.
see inside the windows. It looks like to me an army tank,
It
driving down
does.
the road.
It
And
does.
so they picked the Tulsa first of all for their getaway, which electric car. But on top of that, James, I think if you're going to rob something, you're going to rob it in the Tulsa, and you're going to rob it in an electric car. Maybe do you think you ought to make sure that it's all charged up and ready to go?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
You would think so. But these guys took off for their getaway, and they were found very quickly, not too far from the location of the crime because they had to stop over and charge their vehicle.
Oh my word. Uh,
James,
you
surely
you
you
can't make this
can't
stuff up.
you can't make it up, man. I mean, there's no way you can make that kind of stuff up. It's just that's incredible. So those guys certainly got into the Hall of Fame or Hall of Shame for Charlie's crazy crook of the week.
There we go. There we go. Well, John O'Keefe's niece was testifying in court this past week, and or not past week, the week of your
Week
podcast.
four, yeah, week four.
Yeah, and we had to protect they had to protect the fact that she was a juvenile, so we couldn't see, But tell us
Right.
about her testimony,
Well,
and did it
there
hurt?
there were some reporters that were they did allow 10, I think 10 reporters to come in and to observe it so they could report on it. So we do have information on it. And to answer your question whether it hurt or helped the defense, the question is or the prosecution and defense. I believe bottom line is that she helped both. I think she helped the prosecution because she certainly testified and I think everybody probably, had a lot of sympathy toward his niece because remember now, his niece was not. I mean, he was his niece, but it was more than that because he was their guardian. You
Right,
remember that,
right,
her parents had died, so he was raising. John O'Keefe was raising these kids,
right,
and so certainly she had, I think, a lot of support in the court when she came in. She did verify, and I think it did hurt, perhaps, or I should bolster the prosecution, that there was certainly trouble in paradise. By that I mean, and I think it's been proven that John O'Keefe and Karen were not doing great as a couple.
right.
And she even talked about the fact that, they went on a trip to Aruba. Karen thought that John was cheating on her,
Hmm.
and that from there it got worse and worse and worse, that there were all kinds of arguments. She mentioned the fact that one time John O'Keefe said to her, "Why don't you just go home?" And she wouldn't go home.
Right.
And so this niece certainly bolstered the prosecution in the fact that there was trouble in paradise. However, when upon cross-examination, very delicately, it would be for any attorney to cross-examine a young lady like this. They did find that she admitted that there was a lot of good times that she
Mm-hmm.
had with Karen. She would fix her hair. They would go places, they would do things, and so there were some good times, as there are in most relationships like this. But I think the biggest help for the defense was that the cross-examination did get this fact in that she did say that she never ever saw any physical violence between them.
So no
While there
domestic
was
violence.
arguing, yeah,
Yeah.
there was no physical domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And as if you've been following this case, you can see that the investigators and the prosecutor at the very beginning of this case, and you can see it throughout this trial too, they're trying to drive the fact that Karen Reed, intentionally hit him
Mm-hmm.
because of a domestic violence situation.
Right.
And so by the niece coming back and saying, "Hey, in all of this though, never one time have either of them been violent at each other," I think was a plus for the defense. So
I
I
agree.
think when you see the niece, you see a plus for the prosecution. There was a problem, but also a plus for the defense because in this problem it never had come to the points that there was violence.
Gotcha. Well, tell us about the second unexpected thing during week 4.
Well, the second unexpected thing was that there was a new video that was introduced. It wasn't introduced into the first trial, and we know now that in Sergeant Mechanic that they used Sergeant Mechanic as we talked about last week. They had him read those texts between Karen and Brian Higgins, who is the ATF agent who was in that house that night.
Right.
And we do know that there was something going on between Karen and Higgins, and what the defense was trying to do, I think, it was to plant in the eyes of the jury and the court that that Higgins had a motive to get in a fight with John O'Keefe.
Right.
And so they're using him for that. And so that that's another way, we're saying every time a prosecution witness comes, they turn him around and they were able to do that. But they did show a video of not Sergeant Mechanic, but of Higgins, who left the house that night after the party and went to the Canton Police Department. And you say, well, what's so suspicious about going to the Canton Police Department? Well, the first trial, they were kind of alleging that maybe he went there to see if anything was on the radar by the police department about the fight.
Right.
But something else came out on this trial. You could actually see him there at the police department, and guess what? He was talking on his cell phone. I mean, it
Mm.
was evident he was talking on his cell phone.
Right.
Now, why is that important? Because they were claiming that all these calls back and forth between the House and Higgins and Brian Albert and Brian Higgins was all butt dials.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you, he wasn't butt dialing unless unless his butt's in his face because he was talking on that phone there at that police department. Now, does that mean anything or not? I don't know. I think it certainly means that it wasn't all butt dials like they claimed that it was, and like he claimed it was when he was on the witness stand.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, do you think the physical evidence will be what will save the case for the prosecution?
Well, there certainly is physical evidence, and I think that this is the strongest part that the prosecution has. There's taillight uh, parts, some of the glass, the broken glass, the taillights is found there on the lawn. There is, his DNA that they found on the vehicle. There was a glass found there. There is physical evidence. There was debris on his clothes.
Mm-hmm.
However, the problem is because this case wasn't investigated correctly. I don't know how impactful that evidence can be because we know that there was at least opportunity for Proctor to plant evidence.
Right.
Now, uh, we know that Proctor was biased in his statements to others, and that could lead some people to suspect that he planted evidence. Now, at this point, it has not been proven that he planted evidence,
Mm-hmm.
but the defense doesn't have to prove that he planted evidence.
That's right.
All the defense has to do is say there is reasonable doubt and that he could have planted evidence, and that because he was biased and because the blue wall that we cops have that we use so well, that he could be trying to cover up for the cops, and he could do that. So
Mm-hmm.
the answer is that there is physical evidence, but because of the way that this evidence was gathered. For instance, there they did not use the standard way of collecting the evidence.
That's
They
right.
did not photograph the evidence where it was found.
That's
You
right.
know, I mean, you could say that they found it in the yard, but it wasn't photographed that way. They
Exactly.
didn't photograph the tail light when they first saw it that morning.
That's right.
All things that is standard in an investigation was not handled, and I haven't yet talked about red Solo cups that they use
Yeah.
and a leaf blower, on the snow,
Right.
and you can see this. The defense again used the prosecution, even these experts, and there were some really sharp people from the Massachusetts State Lab, but they did not gather the evidence. They took good care of the evidence once it got to the lab.
Right.
So then you could come back to them and say to the lab, well, is it standard to gather evidence in red Solo cups? And these outstanding people said no.
Exactly.
Is it standard to use a leaf blower? No. Is it standard not to photograph evidence where it is? No. So these lab people that are phenomenal witnesses for the prosecution turns around and becomes a witness for the defense and talking about how they blotched the investigation. You know.
Right.
So the answer is there is physical evidence, but it's tainted because of the way that it was collected.
So, what caused the most damage to the prosecution this week, and also what makes you think they may be tanking their case?
Well, to me, I think it kind of, if I was sitting in the jury, I would be watching all this, listening to all this, and finally it comes to the point that they call the medical examiner for the prosecution, who is the state's prosecution, the coroner. And I think that she did the most damage because she basically said, the cause of his death was blunt force trauma and hypothermia.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where I think they lost a good portion of the not credibility, but the impact. They lost a portion of the impact because when she was asked what is the manner of his death, she said undetermined.
Right.
And that is, I think, huge
That
because
is
you have
huge.
the medical examiner, you have your own prosecution, you have the prosecutor's medical examiner, you have the state's medical examiner, who is considered a part of that team that you talked about earlier. The
Mm-hmm.
prosecutor, all that.
Yep.
And here is the medical examiner said, I don't know how he died. It's undetermined. And
Right.
and even beyond that, James, she had 90 days after she ruled that undetermined to adjust that or amend that.
And she
She had
didn't.
90 days to do it,
Yep.
90 days where she was told about Karen's alcohol contact,
Right.
90 days after she was told about the tail light,
Right.
90 days after she was told about the glass,
Mm-hmm.
90 days after she was told about the clothes, and still she would not change that. To my opinion, and I believe everybody else, the medical examiner is not under the opinion that she could say forthright, without reasonable doubt, that he was hit by a vehicle. And I think that's very damaging to the prosecution. What do you think?
That. Yeah, I'm with you on that. When I heard it on the podcast, I was like, that is huge. That is huge. So tell us about how a higher court is making an impact this week on the case.
Well, some people may have wondered, during the first case, you would see these things on TV and you would see the crowd and they'd say, free Karen Reed, free Karen Reed. But in this case, the judge moved them back out of the way, a 200-foot buffer zone, so they weren't there near the place where people were coming in. But the higher court turned around and said that's unconstitutional.
Uh-huh.
So this week they moved the buffer zone. Now they still can't, yell at the jury as they're going in or anything like that. But they moved that buffer zone so that the Karen Reed supporters now are closer in. I haven't seen a lot of difference this week, but I haven't been looking for it. But I'm anxious as we look at this week's case and this week's trial. I'm looking to see if that made a difference or not. But we do know that in that first trial, I believe that her supporters made a huge difference, and they really begin to sway the public, the public at least in their own opinion about what happened. You
Right.
know.
I agree.
Yep. Yep.
Also, some of the sound bites of Karen Reed coming out of the court after something was disclosed or when someone lied, that's pretty huge as well.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. No
Yeah.
doubt about it.
Well, what happened at the end of the week?
Well, at the end of the week, they ended up arguing about a motion. The prosecution wanted to bring a guy in that they used as an expert witness, and boy, you and I both know there's a lot to talk about that extra
Yeah.
witness this coming week. But the big thing at the end of the fourth week was this guy who had already done a report wanted to do a new report right in the middle of the trial. Pardon me. The defense now, they were saying, no, man, we're ambushed with this. We don't have time to prepare for it.
Right.
We don't have time to look at it, and this report, of course, was supposed to change the seconds, the variance between Karen Reed's vehicle and John O'Keefe's phone, and so it's a pretty important witness, and so they really tried to argue that to keep that from coming in, but the judge ruled at the end of the week that they were going to allow him to come in with a new report in the middle of the trial, and that the defense would have the opportunity to cross-examine this person. And without saying too much more about next week's podcast, boy, did they examine this witness.
They did.
So, I can tell you, spoiler alert, it's almost better for the defense that she did allow him
Yeah.
to come in as a result of what happened. So let's leave it at that, James, and leave the people kind of on the edge of their seat,
Cliffhanger.
wondering,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, I love cliffhangers.
wondering what happened to this bombshell witness that the defense tried to keep from coming on with that new report, and what happened as a result of that new report. So
That's
some
right.
really fascinating things have happened this week. And I can't wait to get to the podcasts to talk about this week that we're in physically right now. And, it's going to be hard for some people, though, because, courts, there's not going to be court for the next several days,
That's right.
So what are
Yeah.
people going to do with their time? I got it. Go to charliecrimebuster.com or the YouTube channel and do some binge casting,
That's
right?
right. That's
Yeah, and if
exactly
you're all
right.
caught up on Karen Reed, just dive into a bunch of those others out there. They're there for your
Absolutely.
taking, right?
That's right. Well, see, on YouTube, you can search for Karen Reed, and all the Karen Reed podcasts that where we have Karen Reed in the title or even in the message, message notes. You can find all of those episodes right there.
Yeah, there you go.
They'll all show up, and they can watch them and listen to them.
Yeah, and I'd encourage people too, if you're all caught up on Karen Reed, then, get back into the Kohlberger case, because that one's coming up in August,
It is. That's right.
and that's going to be a big, big case as well.
It
And
is.
we were following that. I love that one because we were following it in real time. We were following it when we did not know who the suspect was. Remember
That's right.
that?
That's right.
And
We were.
had no idea who did this, and how this suspect was recognized, and how the suspect, came into to an arrest, So some really exciting things, I think, with the Kohlberger podcast that we did,
I agree.
and they can get ready for August then, right?
Absolutely.
All right, folks, thank you for joining us this week. James and I have had a blast as usual. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep, for the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com, or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @charliecrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/charliecrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.